Hello guys, welcome to another video of the podcast Guts and Glory World War II. Okay, so now, Chapter 8, Dauntless, the Battle of Midway, June 4th, 1942, Midway Island. My orders were to make a group attack on the enemy striking force. Radio silence was to be maintained until sight contact with the enemy was made. That was the extent of my instructions. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, USS Enterprise. A mere 6 months after the devastation at Pearl Harbor, Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo once again had an opportunity to destroy a massive chunk of the United States Navy all at once with a surprise attack. It was around 10 a.m. on June 4th, 1942. Admiral Nagumo was the guy in charge of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet off the coast of Midway Island, a tiny hunk of sand in the middle of the Pacific. Midway is home to a U.S. airfield and randomly happens to be one of the world's biggest habitats for albatrosses, green sea turtles, and monk seals, which, of course, are the second cutest kind of seal, behind harp seals. In a repeat of insanely successful sucker punch sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Nagumo and the Japanese fleet had left from Japan, maintained radio silence all the way across the Pacific, and brought hundreds of aircraft to craterize the island's defenses with gigantic high-explosive bombs. Launching from 4 of Japan's prized aircraft carriers, 108 fighters and bombers filled the skies over Midway with explosions and misery, blasting American hangars, runways, and radar positions into smoking rubble. A couple of Marines on the island managed to get airborne in their Wildcat fighters, but were colossally outnumbered and were quickly pumped full of lead by the Japanese Zero pilots barreling down them from all directions. The rest of the Marines' planes were smashed to bits by strafing runs as they sat on the tarmac. Waiting patiently in the distance, over 100 Japanese assault craft were packed with infantry troops ready to storm the island, capture it, and set up a Japanese refueling base. It was important to control Midway because the island was within striking distance of Hawaii, and possibly even the west coast of the United States. Admiral Nagumo and his boss, Admiral Isaruko Yamamoto, knew that a Japanese base 100 miles from Hawaii wasn't the sort of thing the Americans were going to be too happy about. So when a swarm of U.S. torpedo bombers came streaking in on a virtual suicide run to take out the Japanese carriers, neither admiral was all that surprised. Although none could doubt their incredible bravery, the American wave of devastator torpedo bombers barreling into the Japanese fleet never stood a chance. Slow, outdated, and hard to maneuver thanks to the 2,000-pound bomb on their undercarriage, the devastators were easy prey for the veteran Zero pilots who pounced on them. Diving in from the sun at 330 miles an hour, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol blasted the American squadrons apart, annihilating 3 separate waves of U.S. torpedo planes without suffering a single loss. Of the 41 devastators that took off from the U.S. carriers, Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise, only 6 aircraft returned. Only 1 torpedo hit its target, and that one failed to explode. It just dinged off the ship's hull and sank harmlessly to the bottom of the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo and Yamamoto were pretty pleased by this, and they were even more excited now that they knew an American Navy must be nearby. One reconnaissance aircraft, also known as recon aircraft used for scouting and observation, reported back to Nagumo that they'd found the last 3 surviving carriers in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nagumo changed course to intercept and crush them once and for all. Val and Kate bombers were lined up on the flight decks of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Flight crews worked furiously to rearm them with armor-piercing, ship-killing torpedoes for their glorious counterattack. Nagumo told his crews he wanted the bombers in the air immediately. It seemed as though the Japanese Navy was about to destroy all that remained of the American fleet and make it back to their ships in time for lunch. Right around this time, the first Japanese flight crewmen looked up to see the front propeller of a United States Navy SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber break through the cloud cover and barrel down at him at 250 miles per hour. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey Jr. was a 40-year-old U.S. Navy pilot from Buffalo, New York, and he had been assigned command of Air Group 6 aboard the USS Enterprise. At the head of the 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless attack aircraft, McCluskey had taken off from the flight deck a couple of hours earlier with orders to attack the Japanese fleet. Unfortunately, when he arrived at the place they were supposed to be, the Japanese weren't there. McCluskey wasn't in the mood to ask for directions like some kind of tourist, so he ordered his men to look for any sign of the enemy. Acting on a hunch, he veered his squadrons away from Midway Island and started scanning the horizon with his binoculars. After hours of flying and his fuel reserves alarmingly low, McCluskey suddenly noticed a single tiny speck dotting the endless blue sea. Flying closer, he saw that the Japanese destroyer Arashi was racing ahead at full flank speed, oblivious to the deadly formation flying high above it. The Arashi had broken away from the Japanese fleet a few hours to back off a fight on an American submarine, but McCluskey didn't know this and decided to follow it. The Arashi led him right to the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet at the exact moments when all of its fighter planes were down at sea level, finishing off the last of the doomed U.S. torpedo bombers. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-0s were some of the fastest and most effective fighter planes in the world. But even at top speed, it would have taken them 7 minutes to climb from sea level to 15,000 feet to engage McCluskey's bombers. He wasn't going to give them a chance. The bomber's 1,200 horsepower engines violently roared to life as McCluskey rolled his plane onto its side and accelerated into a 252-mile-per-hour dive with his nose pointed almost straight down. Behind him, 32 aircraft followed suit, each one aiming for a red rising sun painted on the deck of a Japanese carrier. Dive bombing in World War II was like a cross between the Blue Angels and a suicide attempt. Basically, your aircraft starts at 15,000 feet, roughly half the altitude of a commercial airliner. Then you do half a barrel roll, turning your plane upside down so you're looking up at the ocean, and you dive at a 70-degree angle at full speed through a field of anti-aircraft flak and heavy machine gun fire. If the bullets don't kill you, your plane doesn't break apart from the crazy amount of stress you're putting on it, and you don't physically black out, barf, or panic, you then somehow get to just 1,000 feet above the ground, hit the button that releases 2,250 pounds of bombs, and hammer back on the flight stick as hard as you possibly can. If you manage to withstand a force 9 times the strength of gravity, crushing your entire body, like a roller coaster from hell, all you have to do is hope your plane pulls up before you crash into the ground and explode into a gigantic fireball. It's basically bungee jumping with a bomb strapped to you, and the planes scream down like in old movies when they're on fire and going down. Now imagine dozens of aircraft doing this in unison, one wave after another, through a sky filled with tracer gunfire, black smoke, and anti-aircraft flak explosions. They dive straight toward the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers whose flight decks are loaded up with gasoline trucks, bombs, and anti-ship torpedoes. Fireworks. Wade McCluskey's vision came back into focus as he leveled out of his dive, dropped his Dauntless to a mere 20 feet above the water, and thrust his throttle forward so hard he was basically pushing it through the plane's control console. Behind him, he heard explosion after explosion as Japanese aircraft carriers, caught completely unprepared, were racked by dozens of direct hits from devastating explosive bombs. The Kaga and the Soryu were burning all across their decks. The Akagi, crippled by a direct hit that penetrated all the way through the deck, was already tilted to its side and sinking into the sea. But McCluskey wasn't out of the fire just yet. As he was admiring his handiwork, a tracer fire zipped past his cockpit, splashing up the water behind him. The naval aviator looked up to see 2 Zeros chasing on him, and the Japanese pilots were pretty righteously angry about getting their homes blown to smithereens. Diving and weaving at such low altitudes that his wingtips practically touched the water, McCluskey evaded the 2 Zeros. In the backseat of his cockpit, the radio operator opened fire with a rear-facing .30 caliber machine gun, spewing hundreds of rounds of ammunition at the attackers. After nearly 5 minutes of a white-knuckle firefight, McCluskey's gunner found his mark, blasting Zero so hard that the impact broke the cockpit on McCluskey's Dauntless. When he landed on the Enterprise later that day, McCluskey counted 55 bullet and shrapnel holes in his aircraft. By the time the battle ended, 4 Japanese carriers were at the bottom of the sea. With them went 250 airplanes and 3,000 sailors, many of whom were critical mechanics and flight crews servicing Japanese aircraft. The United States lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, which was hit by bombers and submarines later in the day. But the victory was decisive and complete. It was a demoralizing loss for the Japanese, the first defeat they'd suffered at the hands of a foreign power in 250 years. The Midway invasion fleet was called off, and the Japanese suddenly found themselves on the defensive. The fight for Alaska. To distract the United States from Midway, the Japanese simultaneously launched an attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, setting up bases on the deserted islands of Attu and Kiska. They were able to launch raids on U.S. naval bases at Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. The Japanese held the islands for nearly a year, but in May 1943, an American landing with a 1,000-men suicide charge through snow and mud in the mountains that ultimately proved unsuccessful. Saburo Sakai. The most famous fighter pilot in the Japanese Navy was Saburo Sakai, a high-octane Zero pilot who got his start strafing U.S. aircraft with bullets in the skies over the Philippines in 1941. An expert marksman and a daring flyer, Sakai had already shot down 60 enemy aircraft when he was shot in the head and immediately paralyzed in half his body. But Sakai managed to land his burning aircraft safely and escape, and he was back in the cockpit of a Zero less than a year later. Living by the code Never Give Up, Sakai was wounded 4 times in battle, but fought through the end of the war, spending the last years taking on American bombers that were attacking mainland Japan. Of the 150 pilots in his unit at the beginning of the war, only 3 survived until the end. Reading their texts. Perhaps the single greatest advantage the Allies had over the Axis was that they were able to crack the secret codes the Japanese and Germans were using to communicate military activities. Pretty much anyone who had the right equipment was able to pick up enemy radio signals or read their emails, well, telegraphs, but basically the same thing. So militaries had to use complicated codes so that even if the bad guys were listening, they still wouldn't know what the heck you were talking about. But British and Polish cryptologists working in the UK's government code and cipher school managed to unscramble the Nazi Enigma code, while the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Service built themselves a similar secret decoder ring-style device to translate Japanese commands. This basically allowed the Allies to read the enemy game plan anytime those guys were silly enough to send it via radio or telegraph. And thanks to clever use of the information that didn't make it obvious the Allies had it, the Japanese never figured out that their enemy could hear and understand everything they were saying. As an awesome side note, the Americans disguised Allied signals by employing members of the Navajo tribe to design a code using their native language. Since nobody outside the Navajo nation could speak fluent Navajo, the Japanese were never able to decipher what exactly was going on with the Americans.